"You're too old to dig ditches," he said, "but not too old to die for the fatherland." That was the moment I knew the war was over. Not for Germany, for me. I was 58 years old when the Reich came calling again. A shopkeeper, a veteran of the last war, the one they said would end them all. I'd fought at Verdun, survived the gas at Ypres, marched home with a scar on my thigh and a bitter taste in my mouth. I thought I'd given enough to Germany. But in the winter of 1944, the Reich had other plans. The letter came in November, printed on cheap grey paper with the eagle stamped at the top. Volkssturm order number, Yirmi Yedi, a conscription order, effective immediately. Report to the district office in Charlottenburg. Failure to appear was punishable by imprisonment, or worse. I sat at the kitchen table reading that paper over and over while the tea went cold in my cup. My wife, Greta, didn't speak. She just lit a cigarette with shaking hands and looked out the window. By then, the sky over Berlin was already bruised and bleeding. The nightly air raids had become routine. We'd lost the bakery 2 blocks down just last week. I folded the letter and slid it into my coat. I kissed Greta on the cheek, told her I'd be back by supper. We both knew that was a lie. Before I continue, if you're drawn in by these untold stories of ordinary people caught in the machinery of war, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and like the video. It helps us bring you more voices like mine from the forgotten corners of history. Now let me tell you what it meant to be a soldier again at the end of everything. We assembled in a school gymnasium that had lost half its roof. Maybe 50 of us, old men with moustaches and limps, and boys who still had milk on their lips. Some came on canes, some clutching rusty hunting rifles. We wore patched coats, old uniforms from the First War, even street clothes. It didn't matter, we weren't soldiers. We were a wall of paper holding back a storm of fire. Our commander was a boy named Clemens, all of 19, with a Hitler Youth badge still pinned to his chest. He shouted at us like he'd seen it done in the newsreels, chin high, fists clenched. But his voice cracked and his hands trembled when he held the pistol at his belt. I looked at him and saw a child playing dress-up in a funeral. We were issued rifles, most of them old Kar 98s with warped barrels. Some men got no weapons at all, only armbands, white cloth with Volkssturm in black Gothic script. A joke, really. The French used to call us cannon fodder. I suppose we were worse than that now. We weren't even worth the cannon. That first week was nothing but drills in the snow. Marching back and forth in the bombed-out yard behind the school, dodging falling plaster and broken glass. They tried to teach us how to fight Soviet tanks with Molotov cocktails and Panzerfausts. Most of us could barely lift them. I remember one man, Kurt, breaking his ankle just trying to throw a grenade. At night we went home, back to cold flats, cracked windows and blackout curtains. Greta started keeping the radio on low, listening for news from the front. We heard rumors the Soviets had crossed the Vistula, they were closing in on Breslau, then on Frankfurt an der Oder. The Eastern Wall was gone. All that remained was Berlin and us. I wasn't angry, not then, not yet. I was confused, disbelieving. We'd all known the war was lost. We'd known since Stalingrad, since Kursk, since the bombs began falling on Dresden and Hamburg and Cologne. But no one said it aloud. That was treason. Instead, they gave us armbands and rifles and told us we were Germany's last hope. I remember sitting with Greta on New Year's Eve, 1944. We lit a candle, just one. There were no fireworks, just silence and the occasional rumble in the distance. I held her hand and she said, "Promise me, Wilhelm, don't be a hero, come back." And I told her, there are no heroes left, only survivors. The streets changed after that. Every building wore a scar, every alleyway whispered death. Children walked barefoot in the frost, searching for coal that wasn't there. The posters began to fade and peel, slogans about victory and honor curling up at the corners like dying leaves. Still, the letters kept coming. All units to report. Reassignment. Prepare to mobilize. The final battle was coming. Berlin would stand, they said. Berlin would fight. I remember looking in the mirror before my deployment and barely recognizing the face staring back. Grey stubble, hollow cheeks, a uniform too large in the shoulders. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was just a man trying to remember what life had felt like before the world caught fire. And yet I went, because when a nation teaches obedience as a virtue, silence becomes the loudest command. They handed me a Panzerfaust and pointed to a boy who couldn't grow a beard. "Follow him," they said. "He knows the drill." That boy was 15. He didn't flinch. I did. We were deployed to the outskirts of Berlin in January of 1945, just as the snow turned to ice and the Red Army closed in like a tightening noose. Our orders came wrapped in fanaticism: defend the capital at all costs, hold the Soviets on the Oder line, and if necessary, die like heroes. But we weren't heroes. We were the Volkssturm, the old and the young, cannon fodder stitched together with desperation. My unit was assigned to reinforce positions in the Friedrichshain district. That's where I first met them, the Hitler Youth. They marched in with shiny eyes and soot-covered boots, boys of 13, 14, maybe 16 at most. Their uniforms hung off their bones, too big, too clean. Some carried rifles almost taller than they were. Others gripped Panzerfausts like toys. Their faces were still pink from the cold and innocence. There was one boy, Johann, who looked no older than my grandson. He wore a crushed officer's cap, tilted to the side, and barked orders like he believed the Reich still had a future. I watched him draw chalk diagrams in the snow, outlining ambush points and fallback lines with the precision of a schoolboy doing his homework. He looked at me and said, "You served in the Great War, right?" I nodded. "Good. Then you know how to kill." I wanted to correct him. I wanted to say, "No, son, I know how to survive." But I said nothing. Before I go deeper into this next chapter, a reminder. If these stories move you, if you believe it's important to remember the faces history often forgets, subscribe and like this video. It keeps these stories alive. Now let me tell you about the madness of watching boys lead men to their deaths. We dug trenches along the tram lines, reinforced basements with sandbags, and tied piano wire across alleyways as makeshift booby traps. The frost made the ground like stone. Every blow of the shovel echoed like gunfire through the broken streets. The teenagers worked with manic energy. They were fueled by propaganda, by fear, and by dreams of martyrdom. They sang songs, not the old soldiers' tunes we used to hum in the trenches of France, but new ones, shrill and urgent, about the Führer, about glory, about blood and soil. I remember watching one boy, maybe 13, struggle to hoist a crate of grenades. His hands were raw. He wore mismatched gloves. When he caught me looking, he smiled, not because he was proud, but because he wanted to prove he wasn't afraid. That broke me more than anything. One night, we sheltered in the remains of a church off Landsberger Alley. The altar had collapsed. The crucifix lay splintered across the pews. We huddled near the shattered stained glass, warming our hands over a tiny fire fueled by hymn books. Johann sat beside me, polishing a rifle. He asked if I had children. I did, I said. 2, a boy and a girl, both gone now. He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. He just said, I hope I die in Berlin. I didn't know what to say. The first firefight came in February. A Soviet reconnaissance unit pushed into our street under cover of fog. We were ordered to ambush from the rooftops, a tactic that worked well in theory if the building hadn't been shelled the night before. The stairs collapsed beneath us, and 3 men broke their legs before a shot was fired. Still, we held. I fired my rifle once, maybe twice. I missed. A Panzerfaust team scored a lucky hit on an armored car. The explosion lit up the dusk like a second sun. Cheers erupted from the boys. Johann ran across open ground to retrieve the enemy's weaponry. He made it halfway. A sniper's shot caught him in the throat. He fell into a snowbank, mouth open, eyes wide, hands still clutching a grenade he never pulled. The cheering stopped. One of the younger boys screamed, another vomited. I stood there, useless, rifle hanging limp, watching the snow turn red. We buried Johann the next morning in the courtyard of an apartment building. No flag, no cross, just a helmet on a stick. Someone whispered the Lord's Prayer. Someone else cursed the Soviets. I said nothing, because the boy wasn't the enemy, and neither were the ones coming to kill us. That was the moment I began to understand. The Reich wasn't just collapsing in rubble, it was collapsing in souls, in the eyes of children forced to die for the madness of old men. I didn't cry when Johann died. I didn't cry when we pulled his body into the cellar and left it there, frozen stiff. But that night, I dreamed of my son, Emil, who died in 43 on the Eastern Front, and I saw his face in Johann's. The next morning I burned Johann's orders. That's all I could do. The ground trembled before I heard the sound. A distant thunder, not of storms, but of gods gone mad. The Soviets had begun their final symphony, and Berlin was the stage. April 16, 1945, the Battle of Berlin had truly begun. They said it started with 20,000 Soviet guns firing in unison along the Oder-Neisse line. I wasn't there to see that opening salvo, but I felt its echo in my bones. The air itself seemed to break. Windows shattered miles away. Dogs howled and birds vanished. Children, the ones still alive, stopped crying altogether, not from calm, but from sheer terror. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the Soviets had pushed to the outskirts of the city. I was stationed in the Moabit district near the Spree River. The roar of Katyusha rockets became our lullaby, and the sky turned a perpetual grey-red. Smoke, dust, and ash blanketed everything. We dug in among the ruins, Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, a few wounded Wehrmacht stragglers. Our command post was the burned-out shell of a bakery, still smelling faintly of bread, now overrun by rats and fear. We had no fuel, no food, no radio contact, but we had orders. Before I take you deeper into the hell that followed, please, if these untold voices from the past speak to you, subscribe and like this video. These stories are pieces of truth carved from the bones of war. And we must not forget. Now let me show you what the end looked like from the inside. By April 25th, the Soviets had encircled the city completely. Berlin became a coffin, and we were its pallbearers. The buildings around us became tombstones. Streets turned into killing zones. We scurried between craters like insects, trying to find cover that didn't exist. Entire city blocks vanished overnight beneath Soviet shellfire. I remember standing guard at a checkpoint near Lehrter Bahnhof. It had once been a proud rail station. Now it was just twisted steel and the acrid smell of burning fuel. A squad of Hitler Youth was stationed nearby. 12 boys with panicked eyes, all of them eager to prove they were men. One of them, Otto, had been hit in the arm the night before. It was turning black, but he refused to leave. "They said I'll get the Iron Cross if I hold," he told me, gritting his teeth. He was 14. There was no heroism left in Berlin, only delusion and blood. On April 26th, the Tiergarten was hit by artillery. I saw the Volkssturm Zoo erupt in fire as shells pounded the massive concrete towers. The animals were already long dead or gone, but I remember the sound of the parrots screaming, those that had survived, echoing through the trees like ghosts. The Soviets were ruthless, but we were no different. Desperation eats away at mercy. In a narrow alley near Invalidenstrasse, I saw a comrade, one of ours, shoot a woman suspected of aiding the Soviets. She was just trying to reach her child across the street. When the bullet hit her, the baby in her arms kept crying even as she slumped into the rubble. No one went to help. We were beyond salvation. By April 28th, the front line had reached the Reichstag. From my position at the Hohenzollern Canal, I could see the fires licking the horizon, the silhouette of that cursed building glowing against the night like some pagan altar. We were told to hold the bridges, that they must not cross, that we must protect the Führer. But no one said his name anymore. Whispers spread that he was in a bunker beneath the Chancellery, delusional and drugged, ranting about phantom divisions that didn't exist, that Goebbels was still giving speeches in the underground hallways, that Eva Braun wore her wedding dress underground while the world collapsed above her. Meanwhile, I stood in ankle-deep water, clutching a rusted rifle, watching men younger than my grandson die for the fantasies of a madman. We lost the canal on April 29th. They came at us with tanks, Soviet T-34s grinding over the barricades. The anti-tank guns we were promised never arrived. Our only defense were a few Panzerfausts and the suicidal courage of boys who had nothing left to lose. One of those boys, I never knew his name, ran straight at the tank. He held the rocket launcher steady, waited for a perfect angle, and fired. It hit, but he was too close. The blast took him with it. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of him but his boot. I found it the next morning, still laced, still warm. That's when I stopped believing in cause, in victory, in anything. We fell back again, this time to the ruins of the department store. There we found wounded, civilians, deserters, and the dead, all sharing the same shattered walls. A priest was giving last rites to a man who had shot himself. The bullet had missed his brain. He was still breathing, moaning for death. No one helped him. By May 1st, the rumors became truth. Hitler was dead. Suicide. Some cheered, others wept. Some claimed it was a lie that he would return like Barbarossa. There was no more front line, only smoke. No more orders, only rumors. No more Reich, only ruins. The war had collapsed around us. Berlin was dead. It just hadn't realized it yet. It was May 2nd, 1945. The Red Army had swept across the city like a tidal wave. crushing the last strongholds. I had surrendered with a handful of others in the smoldering wreckage of a department store near Friedrichstrasse. But before that, in the hours between surrender and silence, I had seen the beating heart of madness, or what was left of it, the Führerbunker, or rather, the outer rim of it. No one except the chosen had ever entered the deeper halls. But I walked the periphery, just after the suicide, just after the pistol shots, before I take you into the shadowed corridors of that final place. Please, if you haven't yet, subscribe and like this video. These are stories not found in textbooks. These are memories buried under stone and shame. Let us remember them together. Now listen closely, because I saw the end from inside the shell of power. We were ordered to retreat to the government quarter on April 30th. What was left of our ragtag unit, a dozen exhausted Volkssturm, a few wide-eyed Hitlerjugend, and 2 wounded SS men who looked like ghosts in black wool, stumbled down Wilhelmstrasse through clouds of ash and screams. The Reich Chancellery was already rubble. The once grand facade had been reduced to splintered marble and rebar, and beneath it the bunker, the mythic fortress beneath the earth, pulsed like a dying organ. A soldier I recognized from Tempelhof, tall, shell-shocked, eyes permanently wide, muttered, "They're burning them now. He's dead. He shot himself." We asked who, but we already knew. Inside the antechambers of the Führerbunker, the smell hit first. Oil, dust, and something else. Something rotten, sweat, fear, death. It wasn't silent down there. The air buzzed with voices, whispered orders, sobs, the clink of bottles. A secretary sat slumped in a hallway chair, mascara streaked down her face, chain smoking in a stupor. She looked through me like I wasn't there. I passed by a room filled with maps, red lines crossing rivers that no longer existed. An officer was tearing down swastika banners, stuffing them into a crate with shaking hands. "No one will find this," he mumbled. "They can't see what he was." In a side room, Eva Braun's old dressing area, I believe, I found a broken hairbrush, a blood-spattered glove, and a wedding invitation dated April 29th. They had married as the ceiling caved in. That's when I saw the doors. Steel, shut, guarded by 2 SS who looked more like statues than men. They didn't speak. Their uniforms were pristine. One of them had tears in his eyes. The bodies were already gone by then, burned in the garden above, poured with gasoline in the rain as shells whistled down. All that remained inside were stains, the smell of cordite, and silence, a silence so loud I still hear it. I was ordered to carry crates of documents, orders, speeches, letters, to be burned in the courtyard. I saw Goebbels pacing the hallway barefoot, his face pale like wax left in the sun. He was muttering to himself. His wife Magda had a terrifying calm about her. She smiled at me as she passed, her children trailing behind her like ducklings. 6 little blonde angels. I never saw them again. They were killed that night, poisoned, all of them, because the world, in their view, wasn't worth living in without their Führer. The next morning, the bunker was a tomb. Someone had shot the radio. Food was gone, ammunition gone, loyalty gone. Some of the Hitler youth tried to rally. We can still break out, fight to the last man. But no one followed them. Even the fanatics had wilted. I sat near the entrance, beneath a concrete beam cracked by a direct hit, and watched the last believers dissolve into ash. Officers stripped their insignia, burned papers, wept like boys. Some killed themselves. One SS man used a piano wire. I saw it. I'll never unsee it. That afternoon, a white flag rose above the Reichstag ruins. The Soviets surged in with tanks and flamethrowers. No one resisted. We emerged, filthy, hollow, arms raised, stepping over corpses and piles of Reichsmarks that meant nothing anymore. I saw a teenage girl shoot herself on Unter den Linden. She wore a party badge. Her lipstick was perfect, and the bunker, that mythic beast, was left behind us, buried again, not under legend, but under the weight of its own madness. That night, under Soviet guard in the remains of the Tiergarten, I found a brick from the chancellery, just one. I held it like a relic, and then I threw it as far as I could into the trees. That was my goodbye to Hitler, to Berlin, to the Reich, to who I thought I was. What do you do when the war is over, but you are still breathing, when the cause you followed has turned to smoke, when all that remains is the silence and the weight of having obeyed? Before we begin, please like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. This is a story not told in glory or grandeur. It's told in rubble, silence, and regret. These are the ashes of the Reich, and I am one of the last who walked through them. We were lined up on the edge of Tiergarten, beneath a shattered statue of Frederick the Great, now pockmarked by Soviet bullets. The spring breeze carried the stench of bodies and brick dust. A Red Army officer paced before us, cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes scanning the line like a butcher choosing cuts. I expected to be shot. I wasn't. That fact still confuses me to this day. They marched us west, toward makeshift holding camps along the Havel. I had been wearing the same Volkssturm armband for weeks, a pathetic scrap of white cloth with a black swastika, stained with blood and mud. I ripped it off on the second day of the march. Another man stopped me. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need to remember." His face was covered in soot. He carried a wooden cross wrapped in string. I never learned his name. The camp was nothing more than a fenced-off field patrolled by Red Army guards with cracked boots and eyes that had seen too much. We slept in the open, using our coats as blankets and stones as pillows. Food came once a day, boiled cabbage, sour rye bread, sometimes horse meat. I didn't complain. After weeks in the ruins of Berlin, it was a feast. But it wasn't hunger that gnawed at us, it was shame. A young man near me, no older than 18, wept every night. He had been in the Hitler Youth, proud, angry, raised on lies. Now he was just a boy. One night he whispered, "My mother was in Dresden. I saw the flames from the train. I thought she died for the fatherland." Then he laughed. A terrible broken laugh. "There is no fatherland, just dust." The Soviets interrogated some of us. I was questioned twice. The first time they wanted names, officers, party members, SS men. I had none to give. The second time, the translator, a grim Ukrainian with tired eyes, asked me one question. "Why did you keep fighting?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. Obedience, fear, pride, stupidity. I had followed orders from a regime that collapsed on itself. I had watched children sent into battle with Panzerfausts and pensioners like myself handed rifles with no bullets. I had done what I was told, and for what? The translator saw my silence. He wrote something in his book. I never found out what it said. One morning, I awoke to the sound of a woman singing, software barely above a whisper. It came from beyond the fence, where German civilians now scavenged in the wreckage. A lullaby,
Old Prussian, something I hadn't heard since before the First War. I closed my eyes and saw my wife. Her name was Clara. She had red hair, smelled of lavender and rye. She died in a bombing raid, February 45, when the roof collapsed in Schöneberg. I had buried what was left with my bare hands. That song cracked something in me. I wept for the first time. Weeks passed. Some men were taken away, never to return. Others were released into what was left of Berlin, skeletal streets, smoking ruins, children digging in garbage piles. When they finally let me go, I was thinner, grayer, hollow. I wandered west, past the remains of the Reichstag, its dome melted and blackened, past the Brandenburg Gate, where crows perched on the quadriga's broken wheel. I found my home, or where it had been, only the cellar remained. I slept there for 3 nights. On the 4th I burned my old uniform. I watched the flames consume the wool, the leather, the badge of my shame. Ashes, that's all that was left. I tell this story now not for sympathy, not for redemption, but for truth. I was not a hero. I was a cog, an old man in an old machine, clanking toward its own destruction. I believed in nothing but survival. But belief is not required for guilt. Obedience still has a price. And mine was silence for many years.
Berlin was a city without breath. Its streets were bones, its buildings hollow shells, and yet among the ruins, life clung like moss to stone. After my release from the Soviet camp, I found myself walking through a Berlin that was no longer a city, but a graveyard, a place where ghosts wandered in daylight and the living moved like shadows. Before I go on, if these stories of survival, loss, and resilience speak to you, please subscribe and like this video. They are the whispers of a forgotten past, voices we must keep alive. I returned to my neighborhood, or rather what was left of it, in the spring of 1945. The streets I had once known were now cracked, scorched, and crumbled, but they were still home. Home to those who remained, the broken, the desperate, and the few who refused to leave. I met people who had nowhere else to go, widows clutching ragged children, old men who had lost their families, women scavenging for scrap metal to trade for food. We called ourselves the ghosts, survivors who haunted the ruins of a dead empire. One such ghost was Frau Engel, a widow who lived 3 doors down. She had lost her husband and son in the war and survived by cooking meals over a barrel fire in the street. I shared what little food I had with her, and in return she offered stories of a Berlin that no longer existed. The nights were the hardest. Without electricity, the city was swallowed by darkness. The cold crept in like a living thing. We huddled in basements and cellars, listening to distant gunfire, the rumble of tanks, and the endless groans of a dying city. Sometimes the silence was worse than the noise. I remember one night sitting in a ruined cafe with a handful of survivors. We drank watered-down schnapps and shared memories, not of the war, but of the days before it, when life was simple and hope was something you tasted in the air. We laughed quietly, sometimes bitterly, about the absurdity of it all, about how the government had sent old men and children to fight, how the Führer had disappeared underground, and how the world had burned while we stood frozen, watching. But survival was not just about food or shelter. It was about holding onto the fragile threads of humanity. We found solace in small acts of kindness, a shared loaf of bread, a hand to hold, a whispered prayer. In one cellar I met a young mother who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front. She held her baby close, singing lullabies that echoed through the cracked walls. Her strength was a beacon in the darkness. It was in these moments that I understood the true cost of war, not just the lives lost on the battlefield, but the shattered souls left behind. Yet amidst the ruins, the city began to breathe again. Children played in bombed-out playgrounds, markets reopened in the streets. Artists sketched the devastation, trying to capture the pain and hope intertwined in every broken corner. Berlin was wounded, but it was not broken, and neither were we. The war was over, but the silence that followed was louder than any gunfire. The rubble beneath my feet was not just stone and brick, but broken lives and shattered truths. We were survivors, but at what cost? I had returned to a city that was physically scarred beyond recognition, but the deeper wounds, those inside our hearts and minds, would take far longer to heal. Before we begin, if these stories resonate with you, please subscribe and like this video. The past is a fragile thread, and through memory, we keep it from breaking. The initial days after liberation were a blur. Berlin was split into zones controlled by the Allies, American, British, French, and Soviet, and none of us knew what would come next. The city's infrastructure was crippled, and thousands were homeless, hungry, and desperate. I wandered through the ruins, passing once grand boulevards now littered with debris. The faces I saw were a mix of exhaustion and fear, hope and despair. Some were returning from the camps. Others were trying to rebuild from ashes. All were burdened by memories too heavy to carry. The Volkssturm, what was left of us, was disbanded quietly, like a bad dream fading at dawn. There was no parade, no thanks. We were men and boys thrown into a war not our own, sent to die for a cause that had already crumbled. And now we were ghosts, forgotten by the new Germany emerging from the ruins. The war had taken everything from me, my family, my home, my youth, and left me with questions that would never be answered. Why had we followed orders so blindly? Why did we believe in a lie so deep it consumed an entire generation? Could any of it have been worth the cost? I found myself in small groups of survivors, old soldiers, widows, children, gathering in cafes and cellar rooms, trying to piece together what had happened and how to live with it. Some sought forgiveness, others demanded justice. The Nuremberg trials were distant, but their shadow fell over us all. The war criminals were exposed and condemned, but what about the ordinary men, the ones like me, who had done their duty blindly in the darkest hours? I remember a night in a cellar on Potsdamer Platz, where a handful of us sat around a flickering candle. Among us was an old sergeant named Heinrich, who had fought in the First World War and had been part of the Wehrmacht. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "We are the lost generation, Wilhelm. Not heroes, not villains, just lost." That phrase stayed with me. We were the shadows left behind, men who had survived a war not of their making, burdened by the weight of survival itself. Slowly, life began to return to Berlin. Markets reopened, schools restarted, and churches offered sanctuary, not just from physical storms, but from spiritual ones. I found work as a laborer clearing rubble, rebuilding walls, and repairing what little could be salvaged. Each stone I lifted was a reminder that destruction, no matter how complete, could be undone. But inside, many of us carried invisible wounds. I struggled with nightmares, faces of the boys who died in my unit, the screams from the bunker, the smell of burning flesh. Greta's face haunted my dreams. I wondered if she had survived, if the city's ruins had swallowed her whole. Letters from my sister finally arrived months later. Terse, broken lines written from the countryside. She had survived, Greta had not. Grief and guilt were constant companions. Reconciliation was not easy. I met former comrades who had joined the Nazi Party willingly, and others who had resisted in silence. Some tried to rebuild their lives by forgetting, others sought redemption through acts of kindness and community. I volunteered at a shelter for war orphans, children too young to remember peace, raised in a world of loss and fear. Their laughter was fragile, but real. Their presence reminded me that the future still mattered. The war had ended, but the reckoning was only beginning. We were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about nationalism, obedience, and the dangers of blind faith. I spoke little of politics. Instead, I spoke of people, the boys in Friedrichshain, the mothers in the ruins, the soldiers in the bunker, because it was their stories that needed telling. Years later, when the Berlin Wall divided the city, I found myself on the western side, a stranger in my own home. The division was another scar, one imposed by politics, not bombs. But the lessons of war were still there, etched in the stone and in the hearts of those who remembered. Now, as an old man looking back, I see how fragile peace really is, how easily fear can turn neighbor against neighbor, how the thirst for power can consume the innocent, how obedience without conscience can destroy a nation. I tell my story not for blame or anger, but for remembrance, so that the long shadows of the past might not darken the future. The guns fell silent, but the war did not end. It moved inside me, a shadow that refused to fade. Survival was not the end. It was only the beginning of a different fight. The war was over, but I carried it with me, like a stone in my chest. The world outside slowly healed, but inside, I was still trapped in the rubble. Returning to civilian life was a foreign language I had to learn all over again. I was no longer a soldier, no longer a Volkssturm conscript fighting in the streets of Berlin. I was Wilhelm, a man burdened with memories too heavy for his years. I found my way back to the outskirts of the city, where a few houses still stood amidst the ruin. I rebuilt a small room in what remained of my childhood home, a patchwork of wood and brick held together by hope and nails. Clara was gone. The war had taken her from me, along with my children. I was a man without a family, living in a city that had lost its soul. The nights were the worst. Dreams came unbidden, the faces of the boys who died with me, the screams echoing in underground bunkers, the fires consuming everything I loved. Sometimes I would wake in a sweat, heart pounding, reaching out for a hand that wasn't there. Yet life demanded forward motion. I found work clearing debris and rebuilding what the war had destroyed. Each brick I lifted was a small act of defiance, proof that life could grow again, even from ashes. But the city was different, the people were different. Many returned with broken spirits. Some buried their pain in silence. Others found solace in small communities, rebuilding their lives one step at a time. I met a woman named Marta, a widow with eyes like the cold northern sky. She had lost her husband in the bombing of Dresden and her son on the Eastern Front. We shared grief in silence before words found us. Marta and I built a quiet companionship, not love in the way of fairy tales, but a shared understanding of loss and survival. Together we planted a small garden in the ruins, coaxing life from scorched earth. In the years that followed, I struggled to find peace. The guilt of survival weighed heavily. Why had I lived when so many didn't? Why had I obeyed orders that led to senseless death? The war had taught me many things about fear, obedience, and the fragility of humanity. But most of all, it taught me the importance of remembrance. I began to speak quietly about my experiences, to neighbors, to children, to anyone who would listen, not to glorify war, but to warn against it. I spoke of the boys in the streets, the madness of blind faith, and the desperate hope to simply survive. Some listened, many did not. But the act of telling was its own kind of healing. In the decades that followed, Germany changed. Walls rose and fell. Generations grew up without the shadows of war darkening their lives. Yet, I remained a keeper of memory, a man who carried the quiet burden so that others would not have to. Now, as I sit here, old and worn, I see the faces of those I lost, friends, foes, children forced into battle. I see the city I loved rise again, stronger and wiser, and I hold on to hope that the lessons of the past will not be forgotten. Time has a way of pulling the veil back, forcing us to confront the things we buried deepest. The past is never truly gone. It waits quietly until we are ready to face it. As the years passed, Germany rebuilt itself on shattered ideals and new hopes. Yet beneath the surface, a reckoning simmered, a quiet, painful confrontation with the horrors committed in the name of a nation. For many, including myself, this reckoning was not easy. The war had left scars on the land, but it had also left scars on the soul. It took decades for Germany to openly confront its past, the crimes, the lies, the blind obedience that led millions to suffering and death. I was a man who had lived through the darkest hours. I had followed orders as a conscript, a reluctant soldier in a war that had outpaced any hope or reason. But what did that mean? Was obedience a crime? Was survival a sin? In the 1950s and 60s, as the world moved on, I watched families like mine struggle with silence. Many never spoke of the war, the shame too heavy to bear. But a new generation began asking questions. They wanted truth, not myths. They wanted to understand how a civilization so advanced could descend into such horror. I joined local remembrance groups, attended talks, and spoke with young people hungry for answers. I told them about the boys who died in the streets of Berlin, the empty promises of fanatical leaders, and the quiet moments of humanity amidst the chaos. It was difficult, painful. Sometimes I was met with anger or disbelief. "How could you have stood by?" a young man once asked. "I didn't stand by," I said softly. "I survived, and I learned." One day I met a former Soviet soldier, a man who had also survived the battle for Berlin. We talked at first cautiously, then with growing respect. We shared memories of loss, fear, and the terrible cost of war. He said to me, "We were both prisoners of history." It was a revelation that enemies could share pain, that forgiveness was possible, even necessary. Facing the truth meant facing ourselves. I had to look honestly at my actions and beliefs. I had to accept that I had been part of something monstrous, even if I was only a small piece. Forgiveness did not come easily, nor did forgetting. But I found a fragile peace in acknowledging the past, in telling my story without excuses or blame. I also began to understand that the future depended on remembrance and vigilance. The lessons of obedience, propaganda, and fear must be passed on, not as history alone, but as warnings etched into our collective conscience. The city of Berlin itself became a symbol, a city divided, rebuilt, and reconciled. Monuments rose, museums opened, and memorials were placed where once there was only silence. Walking through those sites, I felt the weight of history, but also the power of memory. In my later years, I wrote a memoir, not for fame, but to leave a record for those who would come after, to say this was what it was like, this is what happens when men lose their way. And so, I continue to share my story, hoping that others might learn, might question, might choose a different path, because the reckoning is not just about guilt, it is about responsibility. The war ended decades ago, but its echoes live in me, in every wrinkle, every silence. Survival was never the final victory. It was the beginning of a lifetime of reckoning. I am old now. The city around me is unrecognizable from the ruins I once walked through. Berlin's skyline is dotted with glass towers and cranes. Children laugh in parks where once only rubble lay. Yet within me, the war is never far away. Survival did not mean life returned to normal. It meant living with loss, with guilt, with questions that never quite find answers. After the war, I rebuilt a life from fragments. I found work, a small circle of friends, and later a family of choice. But the shadows lingered. I often walked the streets of Berlin at night, passing memorials and monuments, tracing the scars of history in the stone and steel. I think often about the men I fought alongside. Boys, really, some barely out of childhood. Their faces haunt me. I think of the mothers who lost sons, the wives who never saw their husbands again, the children born into a world they did not choose. Our generation was forced into a nightmare not of our making, yet we bore its weight for the rest of our days. We did not choose glory, we chose survival. In the decades after, I watched Germany confront its past, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with courage. Schools began teaching the truth. Museums opened their doors to the horrors. Survivors shared their stories, both of the victims and the perpetrators. I came to understand that survival was a responsibility, to remember, to teach, and to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. I spoke often with young people, sharing the stories that no history book could capture, the fear, the confusion, the small acts of kindness amid ruin. Yet, I also saw the dangers of forgetting. The rise of hatred, intolerance, and nationalism in the world reminded me that the lessons of 1945 are still urgently needed. Survival is not just about living through war. It is about carrying its legacy with humility and vigilance. I found peace in quiet moments, planting flowers where bombs had fallen, listening to the laughter of children playing where soldiers once fought. These were acts of defiance against despair. As I near the end of my days, I want to leave a message. War takes everything. It destroys cities, families, and souls. But the courage to rebuild, to face the truth and choose compassion, that is where hope begins. Remember those who fought and those who died. Remember those who survived carrying scars unseen, and remember that peace is fragile and must be guarded with care. This is my story, not of heroism, not of triumph, but of a man who lived through the end of an empire, who bore the burden of survival, and who hopes that by telling this tale, others might find a better way. Thank you for listening to this memoir. If you found value in these stories,
Please subscribe and like to honor the memory of those who lived and died. May we never forget.